What that means for business is, yes, you need to always be making sure where your next customer is or your existing customers are happy, but you've got to make sure you spend time thinking about how can you run your business better. How do you automate it? How do you manage your staff better? Where's the next skill set coming from? Am I training these people?
Welcome to the Success Times Happiness podcast, a platform dedicated to engaging discussions with inspiring individuals aimed at nurturing personal development. I'm Richard Thompson, your host, a father, entrepreneur, world champion Ultraman, and passionate about all things high performance. Our mission is to empower both ourselves and you to unlocking our fullest potential, recognizing that this life is no dress rehearsal. While I may not have all the answers, this show serves as our collective journey to uncover them. Today's guest is Warren Hogan, ex-Chief Economist of the ANZ, now working for Judo Bank. Warren is unlike most economists. He has 3 decades of experience, but his ability to talk all about the economy in a language for all of us to understand is remarkable. He says it like it is and without any political bias. Even if you're not into economics, we discuss topics that everyone should know. We really hope you enjoy it, so let's get into it. Warren Hogan, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in the Sunshine Coast, one of my favourite parts of the world.
Now, before we recorded, you said something very interesting, was that who would want to listen to an economist? They're all really boring.
Yeah, the worst thing I could ever do is sit and listen to an economist. Now, it's probably being a bit unfair, but some of the economics can be very dry, and a lot of economists fail to create the right narratives to bring non-economists into the story, and they also use a lot of jargon.
Yeah.
I've spent a career training economists. Some of the smartest people I've ever met, they seem to really want to appeal to other economists, whereas I've taken a position throughout my career that the main role I have is to actually communicate to the broader community. Sophisticated, smart people, but I've got to make sure they understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, it seems like, and certainly coming from your presentation this morning, you do that very, very well. Has it always been the case?
Look, I've always tried, but I started my career in the professional markets. So I was talking to fund managers and central banks and big corporations, and they were quite well versed. They might not have been economists, but they broadly understood it. But it's still, even then, you needed to make sure you communicated in a way. But most importantly, through all the data, through all the technical elements of it, you needed to create a narrative. And that, in the last sort of 7 or 8 years of my career, I've moved towards more SMEs, the real world, which is huge value, the information I get back from what I call the coalface of the economy. But the onus is on me to make sure even more so that I speak in a way that they understand and create a narrative that they can relate to and get access to the analysis, the consequences, because, I'm pointing out this means this and this and this. The economy is diabolically complex and no one fully can comprehend it. So it's all about trying to get it as understanding as best we can.
There's so many factors in play in the economy and certainly where you're positioned in providing the advice or trying to understand it, let alone domestically or a state or on a local level versus the rest of the world. As far as I can tell, your mandate is to try to predict or at least foreshadow what's going to take place going forward.
No, so my father was a professor of economics, and there are so many different types of economists and many who do things I don't understand any more than you would. My job as my particular part of being an economist is to analyse the overall economy and markets within that and state and regional economies, but analyse what we call a macro economy, and then, yes, try and make sense of the potential pathways it could take. And a lot of people, both economists and those who use these services, think about the forecast, the one view. And there's a reality to needing to have that, what I call central case. But there's a range of different pathways that the world can take. Even if we could go forward in a year and look back, that's not set. Something, a butterfly in Brazil. We don't know the future. So there are tools, there are processes, there are causalities that mean we can get a hold of some of it in terms of the economy. We can look at politics and look at history and how certain political things lead to others and make sense of it. But what I do, and it's more of an emphasis as I've moving into the 3rd decade of my career, 30 years I've been doing this in January, is putting forward a range of probable outcomes and giving percentage probabilities around that. And even then, that doesn't capture the full potential. I mean, a war, I'm not going to put that in a probable forecast. It's more and more for me about trying to understand the direction we're headed, the issues that are at play, what's what's important and could change the way things play out. Obviously, at the moment, things like inflation are important. Political issues are important. I try to not emphasize the forecast, even though in reality that's what everyone wants to know. For example, what's your rate forecast? Well, this is it as the most likely, but it could also do this or it could do that, and they're quite highly possible too. So it's that range of possible pathways that I think about. And for my customers who use this intensively, like Judo Bank's management, when they're doing their regulatory risk management and their balance sheet risk management internally, it's very much a long conversation, 3 hours every 3 months and 1 hour every other month about all those different probable risks and ways the economy could play out.
Because the economy is a beast of, I guess, data and input and output that, as sort of like the butterfly effect, one particular trigger and impacts something else, which then on-flows and impacts something else. Over 30 years, 3 decades looking at the economy, you've gone through so many different federal governments, obviously, different, I guess,
economic events.
Exactly, right.
Asian crisis.
Yeah, unforeseen economic events, dot-com boom, the bust, GFC, the Asian crisis, the pandemic, right? The irrelevant wars as well that hit on different resources. Is it just this idea of, are you just trying to assist the banks and assist, is the job to just ride that wave through that as best as possible?
Why are business people, especially successful one, essentially optimistic? And it's because you have to be. And us as individuals, if we're not optimistic and you're thinking about the future, it's a scary place because we don't know. So optimism is such a fundamental, important human trait. Even though it might seem silly, you need it. I don't have that luxury. What I do is I look at and try and make sense of where we're going. Whereas if you're starting your own business, you've got a business plan, you're optimistic and you're going to create your future. You're going to have to roll with the punches. For me, thinking about the future, for the Reserve Bank trying to manage monetary policy and what the right place for interest rates, we don't have the luxury of creating our future. We have to try and deal with what the world is going to throw at us. It's quite an interesting process, a psychological process of, you sort of see a lot of economists, particularly sort of private advisors, not so much working for banks or everything, but they can be quite doom and gloom because the future is inherently uncertain. That scares humans because they like certainty, and it's easy to create horror stories. And people like hearing horror stories, but it's not necessarily what's going to happen. The way you've got to try and look at all the history, economics, the development of economic thought for hundreds of years has these wonderful tools, highly quantitative now, statistical, and we do know causality. If this happens, that happens, and there's lags. Lag is one of the most important concepts in macroeconomics. When interest rates go up tomorrow, that has effects for 12 to 18 months, and currency movements or so on and so forth. I've had the most successful 3 years of my career, which I put down to, A, experience, but more importantly, B, is speaking to SMEs. A leader of a small, medium-sized business is like speaking to the economy. They might not know it, but when I speak to enough of them, the thing I get back to them from them in real time is incredible. But C is bringing in the multidisciplinary, the big picture, looking at the demographics, thinking about the history, the politics, the sociology. You don't overplay them, but you overlay it into the shorter-term standard economic models. And that's been the magic pudding for me, is bringing as much to it. And it's hard. You have to emphasize some things over other things. And, of course, the main thing with macroeconomics, particularly as a public economist like I am, is there's a lot of politics.
Yeah, there's certainly, from this morning's presentation, it certainly sounded like...
It was a post-budget presentation, so there's a little bit more politics than normal in that.
Certainly. And well, it sounded like, I mean, obviously you're a free market guy and therefore it would overstimulation or overuse of a government's not the best thing, but you sounded disenfranchised with the whole system a little bit.
Look, I'm worried where this government's leading us. What's the saying about democracy? It's the worst form of government except for all the others. Same with a free market economy. In fact, if I do have an ideology, it's basically we need a free and open society. We've seen all through history what tyrants do and the propensity through most human existence to be subject to tyranny. We have discovered in the last few hundred years genuine freedom and a way to run big societies with it. That's the most important thing to me. The sacrifices for this that our forebears have made in wars, World War II, etc., are huge. And, of course, the free market economy is the foundation of ensuring that. And that, therefore, means you have to get the right mix of government and the private sector. I certainly don't believe that we're here as a community to serve the government. The government is here to serve us. And I think most Australians accept that's the way it is. And We have seen in the last 40 years how successful we've been when we've sort of allowed the private sector to flourish. You've got to regulate things. You've got to make sure people behave. You've got to have good legal structures and competition policy, all of this, of course. But you've got to try and let the market send the signal about where's the right place to invest. What do consumers want? We know from Soviet Union, 10 people sitting around a table each year working out how many motor vehicles they need is not the best way to do it.
Mm.
You can see in China right now, EVs lying dormant in a field waiting to be destroyed. Whole apartment buildings being blown up before they've been lived in. That's what dictatorship gives you. That's what overuse of government. So we've got to try and protect the market as much as possible while protecting the society from the worst of the market, which can be brutal. It's unfair. It's Mother Nature in many ways. It's the high savanna sort of thing. And we do a pretty good job of that in Australia. We get the mix right. I think we've got the best mix, actually. Europe's probably a bit too far on the socialist side and America's too far on the free side.
Yeah.
So we've got a good mix. But this government's heading in a direction of big government and more government direction in the economy. And while I believe really good quality governments, and we get hints of them occasionally in Australia, New South Wales has had some good governments lately. I think South Australia's got a good one right now. We haven't had a good federal government for a while, in my view.
And you qualified this today by saying you voted for all parties as well. You're not a...
Oh, I'm not a card-carrying member of anything. And
you see it as it is as an economist.
I have to, and I have to have a scientific approach, and that means not being political. But, of course, I speak, and particularly if I say something that the other side, whether it's Labor or Liberal, doesn't like, they'll straight away go on political.
Yeah.
I have a saying, which I actually put on Twitter yesterday for the umpteenth time. I am not doing my job until I've upset everyone. So anyway, we have a government that looks like it's getting a bit more active. I'm just not sure that it's the right direction.
I'm certainly not educated enough to be able to provide much political discord. But from what I can see, the challenge is that political party with too high a swing from the most recent election will believe that they've got a mandate that extends beyond the next election, because if they lose a little bit, they'll still retain office. And that sort of corrupts a little bit, or it gives them too much control or too much freedom. So then, therefore, if you've got a party, and certainly with democracy, you're wanting that change of political parties somewhat frequently to keep the keel even. But then it seems reactionary. All of their measures is not long-term thinking, because they are just trying to get in and keep their jobs. And they're career politicians. They're not particularly great leaders, let's say, or they're not well-versed in that. They're just in Canberra or in Brisbane or whatever level of government you're talking about. They're in their own self-interest to keep their position.
That's right.
So then they're playing the short game of what is the short fix.
Or what is the political fix? What is going to get me re-elected?
Exactly right.
As opposed to the long term.
Up here, back in, must have been maybe a decade or so ago, it was when we had the huge drought, and the state Labor government, the Beattie government, was hounded, and then the Bligh came in, because we had no pipelines, we had no desal plants, because they take an enormous amount of time to build. And so they were getting hounded. We got no resources. We were all down to 2-minute showers a day. It hadn't rained for years. Even in the metropolitan Brisbane, everyone was down to 2-minute showers. And they were getting roasted for not having the foresight. And then they were like, all right, we're going to do the desal plants now, which is all too late. But I postulate, had the previous government gone, we've got plenty of water, we're going to spend 10% of our money putting out a dam up west or a desal plan, and it's going to cost a lot of money, but this is just in case, they would have been announced.
Yeah, so you touch on a few things there. So there's this inherent sort of contradiction. We, want governments to take a long-term view, but at the same time, we want the option to kick them out every 3 years if they're not doing the right thing. And that makes it very hard. The word you used there that I think captures the issue is leadership. Anyone who runs a successful business, which I'm assuming you do, knows that leadership is about not only taking a long-term vision, but being honest about it. And the essence of what I don't like about cynical politics is it's dishonest. And we see that every day, whether it's the government trying to gaslight us on what's going on and convince us of their narrative, or just outright corruption of some form or another. And leaders, what's the saying? A politician thinks about the next election, a statesperson thinks about the next generation. What you got to have is a leader that has conviction and a clear, transparent set of values that are relevant and that the community's behind, they get into power, and has a vision that even though there's some tough decisions that will be unpopular, people are smart enough and I think people are smart enough to see it in the context of that bigger vision. But because politicians are so wrapped up in the politics of getting re-elected, that they just don't have the capacity to have that honesty and that transparency. And, we very rarely see great leaders, and often they only come out of crisis and they're accidental leaders to some extent. So I do worry that our governments in this country in the last 15 years have not been great, and that we're not going in a great direction.
And I think the leadership bit is about the communication to the people to be able to and effectively communicate. To say,
and it starts with honesty.
Yeah.
Not telling lies. I mean, there was a survey on Donald Trump. Everyone knows he lies through his teeth, but people trust him. Why do they trust him? It's not because he doesn't tell lies. It's because he does what he says he's going to do. And that's what the foundation of trust is doing what you say you're going to do. The loss of trust in our community is because people have not done what they're going to say they're going to do. It's a major issue. I think our domestic democracy is under tremendous pressure from technology. We have a representative democracy who are meant to vote in a local member. They form up a party. They run for 3 years and then we kick them out if we don't like them, or we vote them back in. But social media, every issue is contestable. It's more like direct democracy. That's a very different kettle of fish. That's like having a referendum on every bit of legislation going through. And that means our democracy is not functioning. We're going to lose our two-party system, I believe. We're about to see this government probably go into minority, and we might have more minority governments in the future than majority, and that's something this country's not really had. That means government's not effective in my view, but of course, at the same time, government's getting bigger. And of course, you don't want something that's not working well to get bigger.
Yeah, you're investing in.
You actually want it to get smaller. That's one of the reasons America, even though its government's big, the reality is its private sector is big and it's vibrant. And that's why you can sort of get away with some bad governments over there, because they've got such a big, vibrant private sector.
To hold it up.
But it comes at a cost in other ways in terms of social welfare and some horrendous social outcomes.
Yeah. So obviously inflation's a huge element at the moment, and the relationship between government and the RBA. What does the economy look like for you?
It's been misrepresented in the general media. It's not weak. The economy's solid. We've got an infrastructure boom, non-mining, biggest infrastructure boom on the East Coast that we've ever seen, and Queensland's only just about to start participating. It's been Victoria and New South Wales thus far. Our construction industry is at full tilt despite all of the problems with insolvency and the issues we've had there. We have businesses investing more than ever before, and we got data on that this week for the first 3 months of this year. The problem out there is that we threw a lot of money at the economy in the pandemic. We had an inflation shock, which is global. That took hold as a domestic inflation, and the way that we're dealing with it is to crush household incomes. And that's partly because they were boosted so much by all the stimulus money, and people got used to. I mean, the amount of money people spent in 2021 compared to 2019 is just ridiculous. So we've come back. People say the economy's weak because the growth has been weak, but we're still spending more per person in real terms
than
2019. So the weak point is the fact that the household sector's incomes are being crushed by inflation, to some extent higher rates. Well, as I said this morning, that's only part of the story. And, of course, bracket creep. And that's that increased real tax burden on middle Australia because people push up the tax brackets.
So let's talk about bracket creep. The cost of living is increasing at a rate. And let's say your wage increases at the same rate, but your take home doesn't.
Because your tax burden goes up because you're
a higher tax bracket.
So we have a progressive tax system, brackets that go up because wealthier people should pay more. And we all broadly accept that. But it always lags, and it's when you got low inflation, and one of the reasons low inflation is so important, bracket creep's minor.
Yeah.
But when you get a big inflation like we've had, it happens in a rush. Now the government benefits massively because they get extra revenues.
Yeah.
But of course it takes money out of people's pockets, and not just because of the inflation, but because of a higher tax burden. If you're a big government person, which, broadly speaking, the left are, they think governments are here to solve our problems and a bit of tell you what to do. We saw them thrive in the pandemic. They don't mind bracket creep. They'll defend it. 45% of the world's advanced economies, the OECD economies, have index tax brackets so that every year the tax bracket moves up with inflation so you don't get bracket creep.
Yeah, right.
Now, there's arguments 2 and 4. If you have low and stable inflation, I don't mind a little bit of bracket creep. But with this inflation surge, I think it's actually been the main factor hurting middle Australia. People are literally just getting squeezed to this very day. Low and middle income middle income earners all across this country. And people say, well, rates, it's rates. Don't put rates up, or we've got to cut rates. It's like there's been one rate hike this financial year.
Yeah.
And less than a third of Australians have a mortgage. And I reckon less than 20% of those have got really problematic situations. I mean, there's still a vast majority of Australians paying off more each month than their minimum repayment.
Yeah.
So this story, this narrative that's been created by people in the media, by some economists, by government, is actually not true. And it's this idea of leadership. It's not saying the real story. Now, economics is highly contestable. This is the thing. Microeconomics, the economics of a market, basic principles, that's not that contestable. But macroeconomics, the system's too complex for one theory to capture it. So you've got this room for political manipulation, and it's rife right now because there's actually people, academics as well as practitioners and politicians, who think we're rewriting the rules of economics. We're not. You're not running your business under the different principles to what your father or your grandfather or grandmother ran their business 100 years ago. It's still got a P&L.
It's the same forces that are implementing that, or
compound interest. Yeah. That hasn't changed.
Yeah,
it's a very tricky period. And in terms of our economy, that's the real weak spot. Now, it could easily spill over into the business community, and that's what most of us thought at the start of the year. It just eventually has got to catch up. Business has got to pull back. Economy remains soft. Inflation down. Rate cuts. The business sector is robust. It's still investing and it's still hiring. So it's not spilling over. And, of course, now we've got these tax cuts coming, which is just absolutely welcome relief for Middle Australia.
Yeah.
They need it. But the irony of the revamped Stage 3 tax cuts is positioned politically as being for you, the low and middle income earners, and not to give the bad top-end people tax cuts, when that was actually the reform element of the whole tax package. This was Stage 3. Stage 1 and 2 were about low and middle income tax cuts. This was about getting rid of a tax bracket, reducing future bracket creep. So re-engineering it earlier this year and keeping that tax bracket actually means that low and middle income earners are going to be getting screwed over by bracket creep in the future.
Yeah.
So it's
kicking the can down the road.
Well, it's just being disingenuous. And these politicians wonder why people don't trust them. And the other thing I've noticed in my 30 years is even though Australians can't articulate what I just said, or they can't articulate bracket creep, they sort of get it. Not bracket creep, or not that, but they get it that guy up there or that woman up there is not being straight with them. Something's amiss.
It's a gut feel.
You never underestimate the whole community as a mass. As John Howard once said, Australians at elections generally get it right. My extension of that is Australians, in terms of what they do in the economy, generally get it right because they're all making decisions individually that add up to what we're seeing in the economy.
So, as an SME, what things can small to medium businesses do in the short term to mitigate the stress?
All different businesses are going to have different environments. So the stress that everyone's feeling is going to be, well, the cost of business and how do you manage that? Do you pass it on? And many do. Many are, hence we've got the inflation. And how do you then deal with, I think the single biggest issue that's happened and changed in the last 5 years is labour force, is the cost of labour, but also the availability of labour, but skills. Workforce management is just the most important thing any business leader will be doing from now on in, and planning for it, economising on labour, how to automate. We've gone from a world of labour abundance where the big economic problem was unemployment being too high. That was basically the whole framing of everyone's education in the last 40 years in economics, and everyone in the community knows it. So
what's the unemployment rate?
Go down. You've got to get it down. It's too high. That problem's gone. We've got undersupply of labour. That's why immigration,
which makes growth challenging, right?
Oh, well, basically what it means is your economy's up against its capacity.
Yeah, top of the ceiling.
Yeah, and you can't get growth, real growth. And if you push demand into the economy, it blows out of the system as inflation, not as activity, which is in the past with spare capacity, with unemployed people, cut rates, kick the economy along, and it wouldn't create a lot of inflation. It would actually give the economy a kick. The game's changed. And another way to think about it is interest rates and the RBA moving rates up and down and affecting consumer demand was the whole game for the last 30 years. It was all about the demand side. Going forward, it's all the supply side. So the RBA needs to get rates up to the right level, which I think is going to be a bit higher, and probably not do much with them You're not going to have these big swings, or you shouldn't. And what we need governments to be helping business and other organisations build out the supply side of the economy, the infrastructure, the skills, the labour force, the immigration, facilitate offshoring, all of this stuff. The whole world's changed to the point, I think I made it this morning. I've done about 20 presentations in the last 2 weeks. You don't want to solve for the wrong problems in your home, in your business, and in your economy. So you got to identify the problems. And as I said, one of the things that I've employed is my experience, my love of history and other disciplines to realise the world's changing and everyone's got to get it. On the other side of it, the big fall in inflation, the big demographic changes of the last 30 years, it took the world about 15 years to get it. When I came into the market in the early mid-90s, it was still, oh my God, there's inflation and got to put rates up. It was like, wait a minute, no, that's all changing. And it's like rates are going down and inflation's not the problem anymore. And the world took till the turn of the century to get it, for the broader community to get it. The sooner you understand the new operating environment, whether you're a business, a government, whatever, the more successful you're going to be. And at the moment, they're not getting it enough. They're pretty good, but the politicians certainly aren't getting it. It's not part of their DNA. And it's also hard for our politics, because if everyone in the community, the people, business, community leaders, all understand what the dynamics are. We've got labour shortages. We've got to deal with the environment. If we all know what the issues are, then the politicians sort of have to work around that. But at the moment, it's just so open slather on what's important. We've got the most sort of chaotic politics I've seen in my lifetime.
I think also with the labour shortages and the challenge of then therefore real growth of the economy, you have the risk of almost like a pseudo recession when you don't have the capacity to grow it, and therefore there's, even if it's marginal, you have 2 quarters of drop because of that capacity issue. The unemployment's really low.
Yeah, and this is another interesting frame for thinking about this. Is we define a recession as 2 quarters in a row of negative economic growth, and that's everyone's conception of it. And for politicians, and particularly this ALP government, they've just got to do everything they can to avoid that. But actually, that's just a very broad technical measure. And as you alluded to, when you're at capacity, when growth's so hard to come by, it's very easy to have 2 quarters of negative economic growth, negative 0.1, negative 0.2, and that ain't a recession. Recessions are about when businesses fail, people lose jobs, when the economy breaks, when it downturns.
The floor gets pulled out, yeah.
We've actually just had a consumer spending recession. That's what's going on. But if the politicians, because of the political framing of everything, which they encourage, by the way, say a technical measure of recession will be jumped on by the media and that'll be bad for us, so we'll do everything to avoid it. When, no, you shouldn't avoid a technical recession. You should avoid a bad recession. You should avoid unemployment going up 1 or 2%. You should avoid banks getting themselves into problems and not lending, and therefore good businesses not getting liquidity and failing. And of course, if you misdiagnose the problem, you may actually end up creating yourself in a worse situation. And I do worry that this fear of rate hikes in this community in the last 18 months means that we're risking not doing enough, letting inflation getting entrenched, and then leaving us exposed to a point in the next 2 or 3 years where rates have to go up so much, like they did in the late 80s, that you break the economy. That's the scenario we need to avoid. And if it means we need to have a technical recession where no one really loses their job, but you get 2 quarters of negative GDP, so be it. But if the politicians want to avoid that because it looks bad, then that's bad policy.
Problem. Yeah. What's utopia for an economist? What is it? What has to happen for you to say, you know what, there is no issue here? Utopia
is a period of time where interest rates don't have to move much, where they're sort of nice and steady, and that
inflation's 2%,
and 2% inflation, and the economy is growing a little bit above population because we've got some productivity, and we're all able to get a higher standard of living.
We want to grow, but not grow too much, because that will then trigger everything else.
It's all about, the economy is a non-linear place. It's a dynamic system that's constantly adjusting. It's no different to an ecosystem. We go down to one of these areas of a creek and forest, and you go throw in some pollutant, and that's going to throw that system out, and it's going to try and get back to a new equilibrium. Well, that's what happens with economies every day, with thousands of markets all around the world. And all these forces trying to work. So I don't want to try and be a futurist and see what utopia is in the future, but between the early 90s and the GFC, we had an incredibly stable economy that delivered employment and low inflation and wealth creation for our whole community. I'm not saying it was perfect. I suppose that's what utopia is, but that's the closest we've seen from a macroeconomic point of view. And if we can get back to that, where we've got low and stable inflation, rates not moving around a lot, people who want jobs have got them, businesses are investing. And the thing is, the world's dynamic. A lot of people don't want change. We don't want people losing their job. The thing is, people no longer want Walkmans. They have iPods. No, they don't. They have phones. The world changes, and that means the industrial structure changes. That's where the jobs change. And another way of putting this is, what's the advice you give kids these days, and it's been happening for a while, is we don't have jobs for life anymore. You could argue we don't have skills for life. We need to be smart. We need to be collaborative. We need to be skills aware. We need to have general skills, and we need to be prepared to change what our role is in the community. There's also obviously a need to build skills. So we're always going to need doctors and lawyers and economists, but there's going to be a lot of people who are going to need to change jobs. And even as doctors, lawyers, and economists, we're going to have to be adaptive too. So it doesn't sound like there's a utopia out there, but I don't actually think a lot about utopia.
And to be honest, I thought the advice to the kids was to clean up your room, which seems to be my
I think that was a US Marine sergeant said, if you can't clean up, make your bed in the morning.
Yeah.
Whatever you got, doing everything else. And
it seems like that's all.
But
I'm
we
saying
know the
to
reality. I have a 21-year-old and an 11-year-old, and they don't want to make their bed.
Mm.
And it's not actually that bad a reflection, but it's a discipline we should put on them just to be grateful for the structures that they're in their life, and they can make a little contribution to those structures.
So you predicted, against popular opinion amongst your colleagues, rate hikes in the near future. What are the other signs that small to medium enterprise can look for, non-economists can look for, that is a positive message or a negative message?
Yeah, well, the positive message, I suppose, is that the reason I think we're going to need a couple of rate hikes is that businesses are doing quite well. Sure, there's many businesses that are sort of struggling, especially consumer-facing businesses, but generally speaking, businesses are managing through the labour story. They're getting cost pressures and they're passing it on. The negative, I'm sort of hoping, and I know hope's not a strategy, but if we have a couple more rate hikes, that gets us back onto this narrow path and we don't see a major downturn, we keep the economy ticking over. We just can't be too ambitious at the moment. We're trying to get inflation down. And I think that's the thing, is that businesses that have got a consistent marketplace, customers, but I think really, this idea that I said about the supply side of the economy matters. What that means for business is, yes, you need to also always be making sure where your next customer is or your existing customers are happy, but you've got to make sure you spend time thinking about how can you run your business better? How do you automate it? How do you manage your staff better? Where's the next skill set coming from? Am I training these people? And I think for SMEs, it's hard because they don't have the scale of large corporations. But it's easy in the sense because they're not massive, they have control and it's doable. Get advice. I do work with a company called the Executive Connection, which has SME CEOs get together in groups and talk through their issues, and it's sort of a peer sort of support. And that's a great way for people to not only get insights about how to do it, but to talk about their story when they don't have, all these CHOs and CIOs that big businesses have to help them in their support. And I actually think mid-sized companies, maybe not so much really genuinely small business, but mid-sized companies have a better chance of being agile and adapting because it's less bureaucracy, less size to deal with. But it is about focusing on your business. You can never lose sight of your customer. We know that. Every good business person knows that. Customer. But you've also got to, I think, focus on managing your staff, and you got to get used to the fact that the cost of capital's up, and that's staying up. The cost of labour's up, and it's probably not going to change much, particularly under this government with their IR changes, which worry me. They're just reducing the flexibility of what's already a tricky market.
Have you found that over the 3 decades you've become more optimistic because you've weathered the storm and you've gone, it's all going to be okay? Yeah,
well, the maturity and the experience gets you from that point I said at the beginning is, I literally am one of the people in our society charged with trying to look into the future in a serious, structured way. And it's a scary place because it's so uncertain. And as I said, there's a lot of economists and probably younger ones, it's the doom and gloom, the stock market's going to crash. It's easy to create the scary story. What's hard is to create the optimistic story. But the optimistic story is the reality. It's the human story. We overcome, we address, we deal with problems as an individuals, as businesses, as communities. It's not always easy, and there's always a disaster around the corner. But I found it's a part of my discipline is to stay optimistic. And it's also, when I was working with the professional market in a dealing room with traders and hedge funds and fund managers, they all loved the scary story. It was volatility in market. They could trade it. I now speak and work mainly with real people, real businesses, and I don't have the luxury of scaring the shit out of them. My job is to help them remain optimistic, which they are naturally. Business leaders are optimistic people, but also to help them manage for, the challenges of a good future. It's actually been hard, and it's probably ironic that I've probably been the most focused on that in the last few years, because the last 2 years has seen something this country hasn't seen for generations, and that's this massive crunch in people's standard of living. This isn't just a hypothetical. This isn't, there's a bit of inflation and your wages hasn't kept pace. And I mean, we have crushed living standards to the tune of 10% in the last 3 years. And this country for 40 years was built on just gradually etching out a better living standard each year. 1%, the little things just, and that's the thing. And you see this in so many human endeavors. The good stuff happens gradually, grinding, persistent. You screw it up, and it can all happen quickly. I think that's the sadness of the last few years, and I believe it's policy failure by both economists and politicians.
They just let that run out.
They made it worse than it needed to be. I believe we're getting back on track. That's for sure. The household incomes will grow. The tax cuts will help. Rates, even if they go up a couple of times, it's nothing. We had them go up 13 times?
Yeah.
I'm talking about 4.35 to 4.75 versus 0 to 4.35.
Yeah.
Our society, our community, while seemingly quite tethered in a way, stressed, whether it's the rubbish coming out of the Middle East that's inflicting us here in Australia, or whether it's the concern about the economy or it's the environmental. The reality is the resource endowment of this country is still fantastic and hasn't fundamentally changed. Our legal structures are robust. Our media is pretty good. Could be better, but pretty good. We have so many of the factors that have got us to being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which by definition is the highest standards of living of a major society we've ever experienced in human history. This country has achieved it, and those key factors are still all in place. Good government, good business, character and leadership, honesty, and obviously persistence.
Warren, this has been awesome. I know you got a tea time to get to.
Thank you.
Now the hard work's done. I won't let you go until we get the five quick questions we always ask guests.
Sure.
Which is a little bit off topic for what we've just discussed, but not a bad insight into how you tick.
Okay.
How does success look for you?
Yeah, so it's changed a lot. So obviously earlier it was about being able to have a house, money. Now it's about giving structure to my children and keeping a family unit moving forward, giving them help, but letting them have a life, make their own choices. In parallel with me being an economist, I chose 8 years ago to no longer work in the big system and to go sort of work in government, then in industry, academia here. Big sacrifice financially, but it's all about being a better economist. I could have been an executive. So it's about being a good economist, and I think I'm doing the right thing there. It's not going to make me retire on a beach with a Porsche anytime soon, but I'm being successful as an economist. I think I get respect in the community for that, even though I say things people don't like to hear.
You'd probably get bored on a beach, to be fair. How you view happiness?
It's a tough one. I think happiness is finding that space that you're meant to be in. So when you're sitting around with the family having pizza on a Friday night and you realise this is where I'm meant to be. Playing good golf. You get a kick out of getting a forecast right. I mean, I actually am not getting a kick out of the last few years of being accurate about the economy because it's been actually a bit of an exercise in, no, you're wrong and you're not thinking about it the right way. Happiness is, I think, is being in the right place and recognising it. So there's not so much, grateful is an overused word.
Sure.
But
being in the right place and being able to recognise that is the right place at the time.
Yeah, whether it's
beautiful.
with the family or...
That's really lovely. Most gifted book or most recommended book to read?
So as an economist, if it's an economist book you got to read. It was written a few years ago by an English economist, and the English economists are pretty good. A guy called Charles Goodhart and another guy called The Great Demographic Reversal. So it's economics, but it's not academic level, as in these guys are academic level, but they've done it in a way that's accessible. But it explains why this demographic shift is so important. It's changing the whole game, 50-year cycle. So The Great Demographic Reversal by Charles Goodhart, first published 2019. It's probably the most important economics book, I reckon, of the last decade.
All right. And then if you went to dinner and you could invite anyone dead or alive, but not your family and friends, who are the 4 people?
So it's Michael Jordan, Lenny Kravitz, Sir Jack Brabham, and Captain Cook.
Oh, I love all of that. Oh, goodness.
Do you want me to explain, or do we not have time?
No. No, we're good. I think we can let the listeners postulate on that.
Draw the lines between the dots.
Yeah, very good. And then finally, a guest you'd think we should have on the show.
Yeah, I thought long and hard about it. I mean, as an economist, I think probably the person who can speak well about what is going wrong, who knows and cares, and has got the wisdom, is a guy called Ken Henry. He was the Treasury Secretary. He did the Henry Review.
Yep.
He grew up in regional New South Wales, had a great career in Treasury, had a few wobbles at NAB in the Banking Royal Commission, but he knows what this country needs.
Okay.
If you can get hold of him, I don't know if you can. Yeah, he would be the economics person.
Ken Henry.
Ken Henry. He's
not a maroon either, but we'll let it slide.
Nah, he's definitely a blue.
Warren, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. You really do. You speak the people's talk, and it's wonderful to have. And yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's been great fun.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're logged onto your internet banking, be sure to let the auto chatbot know about the show. Every chatbot that listens is everything. Until next time, peace.